Oh, great. Okay. So yes, this talk is being recorded, and so hopefully we will be posting later or at some point later on the Linda Loring Nature Foundation website. And without much further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Jenica Allen. Jenica is currently the Campus Living Lab Manager at the Miller-Worley Center for the Environment at Mount Holyoke College. She's an ecologist with a diverse research background in plant ecology, global change, quantitative methods, and GIS, and currently works collaboratively with ecologists, resource economists, computer scientists, and natural resource managers on invasive plant issues, which we have some of here on Nantucket. And Jenica and I go way back to the University of Connecticut, where we were in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology together as graduate students. So I'm so happy to see you, Jenica, and thanks for joining us today. Welcome.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm really glad to be here today. Really appreciate the opportunity and the invite to talk. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
All right, and I will.
All right. So I think we are ready to go. So the topic that I'm going to address tonight is something that I've been working on in various ways for a long time and involves lots of people other than me. So you'll see a bunch of the organizations that have supported this work along the bottom of this title slide. So while I'm here talking about some of this work, it is certainly not completely my own. And the main idea that I want to talk about is really this interaction between invasive species and climate change, and ways that we can use stakeholder-driven research to help us visualize and list some of these range-shifting invasive plants that we expect to move to different and new geographic regions as climate continues to change. So in order to sort of understand the context of this work, I first want to talk about the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, which is a mouthful. I'm going to call it RISCC for short. And RISCC was founded in 2016 to address the broad question of how can we manage biological invasions in light of climate change. So that's a big question. And it's something that we've pursued in a number of different ways since 2016. There's a core leadership team that helps to coordinate and actually do a lot of the work behind the scenes in terms of products of RISCC. But it's a network of more than 400 invasive species managers and researchers. Mostly across the Northeast, but we have a reach that extends beyond that as well. And so in these times of most of us working remotely, we've had some fun with some Zoom screenshots. And so this is sort of the current leadership team with what we've dubbed our favorite invasive plants. Basically or not even plants, species, sorry. These are species that we love to dislike, so to speak. So I chose Japanese barberry as my background because Japanese barberry and I go way back. And so the mission statement of RISCC is that we aim to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species and climate change by synthesizing relevant science, communicating the needs of managers to researchers, building stronger scientist-manager communities, and conducting priority research. And I put the mission statement on a slide here because it's going to help to guide the pieces of RISCC activities that I'd like to highlight. And so I want to start with synthesizing relevant science. We produce summaries of what we feel are relevant scientific papers. So papers that address invasive species and climate change. So this is an example of what one of those research summaries looks like. We distribute these through our listserv. We also have a website that has keyword tags on it and is also searchable. So there's multiple ways to get to these research summaries. We've also created what we call management challenges, which are sort of these one-pagers on key topics that our network has said they're interested in. So these are 3 examples of those. We make them freely available. They're PDFs that are available for download and printing if you're interested. On a lot of the pages that I'm going to show you, the RISC website is listed somewhere on there. I'll have it up on the last slide as well if you want to write that down. But these management challenges synthesize the existing research around whatever topic the management challenge is about. We also work on communicating the needs of managers to researchers. And so the primary way that we've done that thus far is by sending a survey out to our network to gauge what those priorities are. And I'm not going to talk much about it. There's a lot to dig into in this topic alone. This is the paper that came out of that survey. It is open access if you want to go straight to biological invasions and check it out. But it's also available from the RISC website. And we've used the results of this survey to really help us decide what projects we want to pursue, because we're trying to create material that is most useful to our stakeholders. Building scientist manager communities is one of our strategic goals, and we do that through hosting symposia and workshops. So we've done that annually since 2017, except this year. There wasn't a great mechanism by which we could do what we typically do virtually in terms of having the infrastructure support to do that. So we're hoping to resume with those symposia and workshops that we host as an organization in 2021 at UMass. So keep our fingers crossed. We also host a series of webinars. We've done one in particular on climate smart Japanese stiltgrass management, where we paired a researcher and a manager thinking about how to manage that species particularly in the context of climate change. We have a couple more webinars that are going to be coming this fall, one on climate smart silviculture and one on mile a minute. And finally, really the main part of this talk is conducting priority research. And we set our priorities based on that survey that we sent out to our network. And so this figure shows the % of responses that gauged each of these topics along the vertical axis as high priority, medium priority, or low priority. So the black bars indicate highest priority. And range shifting species and hotspots came out as sort of the second most high priority topic, but when you combine high and medium priority, sort of neck and neck with resilient native communities. And this happens to be a topic that we had a lot of internal expertise within the RISC research group to address. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today in terms of the work and the progress that we've made addressing these range shifting species. And so it probably comes as no surprise, but our climate has been changing and is going to continue to change. With that change comes the potential, the high likelihood of new ecosystems that will develop in the locations that we all sit in. So this graphic is an example of what Massachusetts, the summer heat index, will feel like relative to other places on a map. So if we follow sort of the higher emissions, business as usual emissions scenario, we're going to feel like the Southeast, essentially, by the end of the century in Massachusetts. So that's warm. And, you know, I didn't actually grab this picture given the current heat wave, but we're in a heat wave right now. So it certainly feels very relevant given what our recent weather has been like. And so what that means for all species, invasive species included, is that they have the capacity to shift their geographic ranges in response to climate. So if a species is adapted to southeastern climate, we expect it to shift its range northward to sort of keep pace with where on the map that climate occurs. And so this is just one example of a species that is primarily a mid-Atlantic and southeast species. The current range as modeled by occurrence climate relationships is shown in red. And the gold areas are places where we expect that it could persist, so move to, by mid-century, by 2050, which it's 30 years from now. That actually doesn't seem that far away. And so we see this phenomena with lots of species where we expect to see this northward expansion of the range. And so range shifting species are sort of this interesting conundrum. So we're concerned about them. So these are species that are already in the United States, maybe not in our region yet, but they're here, that we expect to come our way. And so we're concerned because they're labeled invasive, they have negative impacts, but it also gives us an opportunity to get ahead of those problems if we sort of dig into the problem now. And so this figure is one that maybe you've seen before, maybe not, but on the horizontal axis is time. So we could say now is in the origin, and then the future is off to the right-hand side. And then the area occupied by species is on the vertical axis. And so the amount of area occupied and the impact of that species is expected to go up the more time it's been in a region. But we also know that it's both easier and less costly to manage a species before it becomes widespread. So being on sort of this low end of the curve down here that's labeled prevention, or early on in an invasion where it's labeled eradication. And so with a lot of our widespread invasive species, we've already passed that point. But with range shifting species, if we can predict which species they are and where they are going to spread to, we have the potential to either prevent them or eradicate them shortly after their arrival. But we need to know what species they are and where they might occur in order for that to be feasible. And so that's where our research project started. We have a wonderful online resource in EDMAPS, or the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. It's kind of a clearinghouse for geographic invasive species data. And so for many, many species, I think thousands at this point, there are maps like this that are online where for every county, there's shading for whether the species has been observed in that county or not. So all of the green counties here are places where Arundodontax or giant reed has been identified. And so this is great for keeping track of where a species is. But if we want to be proactive about getting in front of range shifts, we need to know not just where it is now, but where do we think it's going? And so that's what we've added to these maps. And so now, if you go to EDMAPS for a particular species, you can see a map that's labeled future certainty. So you'll see these buttons at the top of any species page that will show you sort of this green shaded map that indicates how many models. I'll get to what that means in a second, but essentially the darker green the color, the more certain we are that the species is going to occur in that county with climate change. So by mid-century, so it's the average of 2040 to 2060. We call it 2050 for convenience. And so if we flip back to the previous slide, you'll notice the Northeast doesn't have this species yet. It starts to show up in Connecticut, Massachusetts, parts of New York, by mid-century with climate change. So this gives us some sense of, okay, basically the eastern seaboard is, those counties need to be on the lookout for Arundodonax coming our way. So that tells us the where, but then we also often want to know how likely. And we honestly can't answer that question perfectly. But what we can do is say, under a wide variety of climate scenarios, this is how many of them agree that the climate will be suitable for our focal species. And so this number of models that you'll see here, each model represents a different climate scenario. So there are about 20 different climate models that are published in the climatology literature. We've taken 13 of those and asked the question, where in the future will the climate be suitable for Arundodonax in this case? And so we've done this kind of modeling and mapping for 896 species. So it's not all invasive species in the United States. We've focused very heavily on terrestrial plants, but 896 is still a lot. And terrestrial plants tend to be a group that gets focused on a lot in terms of land management and land stewardship. So our hope is that this is one step towards helping us identify where and which species we need to be concerned about as climate continues to change. We also have this view of the range shift on EDMAPs. So here you can see, again, counties that are shaded. The light purple color are counties where there are current observations of the species, and that county is also expected to remain suitable with climate change. So it's there now, and we expect it to stay there. The dark purple counties are counties where it's there now, but we expect the climate to become unsuitable. So it becomes too hot, too dry. Exactly what changes to make it unsuitable is going to depend on what species we're talking about. But we no longer expect the species to be able to persist there. So those are counties that can sort of say, whew, it might be a problem now. Maybe we still want to selectively manage it, but maybe it'll come off of our plate of something to worry about in the future. The orange counties are counties where the species doesn't exist now, or at least we don't have records of it now. And we expect the climate to become suitable. Either it is currently suitable and will remain suitable, or it will become newly suitable with climate change. And so those are places that essentially need to be on the lookout for the spread of this species. You'll also notice that the number of models selector is applicable on this map as well. So the last one you didn't get to select, you just saw the different colors that corresponded to how much consensus there was among models. Here you get to choose. So you could go all the way down to 1 and say, if any single climate scenario is suitable for this species, I want to know. So that's sort of like one end of the precautionary principle. You know, any possibility, I want to be aware of it. On the other end is an acknowledgement that we have limited time and resources, and so I want to be pretty sure that if I'm going to spend time, effort, money on monitoring for a species, I want to be pretty sure that it's coming my way. And so you could toggle that number of models all the way up to 13, which is the maximum number, to require 100% consensus of future predictions in order to have that be a species that you're paying attention to. So that's kind of like up to you as the user where you fall on that spectrum. We wanted to give everyone, you know, the ability to define their level of desired certainty or consensus. I'll also point out that we have a little feedback button here. So if you start using these maps for particular species and you have suggestions for ways that they could be displayed more effectively, if you've got questions about a particular distributional shift, you have the capacity to get in touch with us with that feedback form. And so those maps are really great if you're thinking at the species level. Maybe it's a species like kudzu that's really well known, and you want to know, what the chance of invasion is or the risk for your area. But we also know that range shifts occur for many species, not just one. And so one of the primary results of the work that we did on the scientific end that was published in this paper in 2016 was this realization that the Northeast was really going to be on the losing end of invasive species or invasive plant range shifts. So these red colors mean that we expect lots of invasive species to shift their ranges into the Northeast as climate continues to change. So we're going to have a net gain of invasive species in the Northeast, which, on the surface feels like a bit of a disheartening message, because it's like, boy, like we're already dealing with some big problems, and we already feel like we don't have enough resources to deal with them. And so you're telling me it's only going to get worse? And the answer is maybe. It depends on whether we can get in front of some of those range shifts and stop them before they become widespread. And so another way of looking at these maps of range shifts is to look at, instead of individual species, look at geography. So we can actually create lists for states or counties of what species we expect to shift their ranges into that location. And so this tool is also on EdMaps. It allows you to select what state you're interested in. Here we've just got an example for Pennsylvania. You can select, if you're interested in a particular county, you can select down to the county level, or you can select all counties to get a state level list. I will sort of give the caveat now that, contrary to sort of like most people's expectations, the county lists are actually longer than the state lists. And so in some ways, you end up with more species to sift through than if you went for a state level list. And we can circle back to talking about that if folks are interested. We have the same choice of number of models that have to agree in order to get placed on the list for your chosen geography. So you'll see I often choose 11 out of 13 models because it feels like that's fairly high consensus without having to be 100%. It's roughly 85% consensus. Then you can also refine the list by particular geographies. So here, we don't really have a geographic refinement on the list. So the species could have been observed anywhere in the country other than in Pennsylvania. And if it's going to potentially move into Pennsylvania with climate change, it will get put on the resulting list, which is in this right-hand panel. The map that you see corresponds to the refined list by selection that you have. So as an example, this is just zoomed in so you can see it a little bit better. We've selected to refine the list by observed species that were observed in the adjacent state. So all of the states that are adjacent to Pennsylvania are in blue. And then states that are outside of that are shaded in gray. So if you have a species that's in California that could shift its range into Pennsylvania, that will no longer get added to this resulting range shifters list by using the adjacent state selector. You can also select by ecoregion and by radius. And so this list that gets populated are species that are not located in the focal state, but have the capacity to shift into the focal state. And you can download that list, save it, and then do whatever you'd like with it. New York State, for example, has been using lists that are generated from this tool to complete their risk assessment protocol on those species, to potentially consider them for proactive regulation. That's just one example of how you could use that list. So this is an example watch list, so range shifter list for New York and Southern New England. So these are species that could currently establish and expand their ranges by 2050. And then species that could establish by 2050 that aren't in the region at all yet. And I don't expect you to be able to read all of the names on this slide, but what I want you to realize is it's a lot of species. It's actually 100 species. And so how do we take what feel like really long lists and prioritize them in a way that makes the list feel more manageable and digestible? And so that's where sort of the next phase of this project came in, where we took these lists and we said, okay, we are going to use an established impacts assessment protocol called ICAT, which stands for Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa. And we're going to investigate these 100 species and see what sorts of management classes, or I'm sorry, impact classes they have. So this is a standardized protocol. It's been adopted by the IUCN that involves a review of peer-reviewed papers for the focal species. So you essentially read the titles and abstracts for all of the papers that mention the species of interest to identify papers that have measured impacts. So that's sort of the first pass. And then once you've identified those papers, you dig into them and you have to actually classify the impacts into one of 4 categories. So the species end up getting classified as either data deficient, so we don't have papers that address the impacts. They get classified as minor impacts, which means they don't have a reported negative impact on native species or communities. They could have moderate impacts, which means that they reduce a single species population. Or they could have major impacts, which means that they reduce community diversity, or they have some sort of irreversible ecosystem impact. And so for these 100 species on our Southern New England and New York watch list, we had a team that scanned 14,000 plus titles. That's a lot. And they compiled data from 865 papers for those 100 species. And so there were 82 species that we ended up evaluating. So 18 of the species were data deficient. There were no papers. 26 of the species had minor impacts, 36 had moderate impacts, and 20 of the 100 had major impacts. And so this already takes us from a list of 100 down to a list of 20 if we're focused on major impacts to dig into further. And so for those 20 major impact species, we did a secondary evaluation for the confidence in the impact score. So how confident do we feel that those major impacts are really major impacts? So we would go back to the original papers and just take a second pass. But then we also tried to assess the vulnerability of Northeast ecosystems to those species. And so that meant learning more about the species biology, what types of habitats they tend to invade, do we have those habitats in the Northeast, that sort of thing. And so that led us to a list of 5 species that we expected to be range shifters into the Northeast with climate change that would have major impacts on Northeast ecosystems. And so you'll see those 5 species listed with their scientific and common names. And you'll see sort of the image is a snapshot of the write-up that we've made public about each of these species. So we've tried to articulate what the impact is of the species, and then what about Northeast ecosystems makes them vulnerable to these species. And then the maps that you see are the sort of number of models maps that I showed you earlier that were colored green, in terms of how much consensus we have or how confident we are that different counties are likely to contain that species moving forward. And so both the publication of the impacts assessments of those species and the digested management challenge are available on the RISC website. Both are open access, free to download. And so I bring us back to this slide to say, we are at the prevention stage right now with these range shifting invasive plants for the Northeast. And RISC, myself included, probably many of you on the call, are working hard to get ahead and stay ahead of these species. And so I would say that, yeah, we've got new risks. We've got lots of new risks. We have 100+ species that have the potential to shift their ranges into the Northeast. But it also gives us the opportunity, you know, myself as a researcher and the RISC network writ large, the opportunity to work together to share what we know and work together to identify how we want to tackle this problem moving forward. I like to take the optimistic view and think that working together, we can actually help to prevent some of these future impacts and essentially learn how to reduce the combined effects of these invasive species and climate change. We're taking first steps towards that. We've started pulling together Northeast invasive species councils to talk about proactive regulation. That's sort of a early and ongoing conversation, but it is getting going, which is kind of exciting. So with that, I think I'll just stop, invite you to join us in this conversation. First stop is our website. There's instructions there on how to join the listserv if you're interested in that. You can get all of the research summaries, all of the management challenges, any webinars that we've given or hosted that have been recorded or posted there. Symposia reports are there. Basically everything is on the website. So it's your one-stop shop. And then if you've got specific questions that we don't end up getting addressed today about the range shifter tools in particular, you're welcome to connect with me after the webinar at my email that's listed here at Mount Holyoke. So with that, I'll say thanks, and I think Sarah was going to moderate questions.
Sorry, I was having a video issue. Thank you, Jenica, so much. This is always the awkward part of the webinar, is we're used to being like at a bar when we have our science pubs, and then everyone claps at the end. So I'm going to clap for, you know, like, but I want to thank you so much, because and to those on the webinar, that I have really appreciated being part of the RISC listserv, because first of all, there's really good information that comes out of research, but I also, like you started in the beginning of your talk, talking about the fact sheets, or I don't know, the management sheets. Yep. Because it's really helpful both as kind of a quick digest of information, but also really shareable. So, and the figures and just the images are impactful. So I think those are really helpful. We shared them with our town DPW when we gave a talk about invasive species management. So I really appreciate that connection between researchers and managers personally as well. So that's awesome.
I always like to hear news stories of how people are using those management challenges. So thank you. We
definitely credited you. But for those of you who don't know, I'm co-chair of our invasive species committee for the island, and Kelly Omond of the Conservation Foundation and we gave a talk to the DPW, and it was very helpful to have some of those images where we could talk about the importance of natives and some of the invasive risks. So I have some questions for Jenica, but if you have any specific questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will monitor questions and we can have a chat. And just a reminder for those who signed on late, we are recording this, so you know, you'll have access to the information and Jenica's contact after the fact too. We'll make sure we share that recording. Okay, so I'm just going to ask my questions first. So I really appreciate this tool as well, because a lot of times when, you know, we hear talks about potential spread, they're quite, you know, like you led with, you know, you can be like, oh my gosh, there's so many problems that are coming our way, and how as land managers do we plan for them? And so I think that prioritizing those is really, really helpful. I've gone through the tool before, and we're fortunate on Nantucket that not only are we Nantucket town, but the whole island is a county, so we can look at island-wide things at the county level. And if we do the county level, even with like the 11 model rule that you said, we get 289 species, whether we do in-state or out-of-state. But if you do the state of Massachusetts, it's 20 or 37, depending on what you look at. So can you speak a little bit more about the county level issues and what you would recommend?
Yes, and I should lead with, I'm still trying to wrap my brain around how to make the county level lists more useful and digestible. But essentially what happens is any species that is not currently in your county ends up on the candidate range shifters list.
Right.
And so if you think about it, there's 896 species in this database. And so if you've got 100 species in your county, I don't actually know what your invasive species list is, but let's say it's 100 species. That means there's 796 species that could potentially be on your range shifters list.
Right.
And so then it goes to the climate suitability models and says, how many of those 796 species are likely to have suitable climate in Nantucket by 2050? And it's a lot.
Yeah.
You know, it's multiple hundreds of species. It's 289 apparently. And so that it's a function of a couple things. So one is that, you know, the Northeast is the potential recipient of a lot of range shifting species. So it's where we're placed on the map relative to what's happening with climate. But it's also that there are a very large number of species that aren't on island yet. Frankly, this long county list issue, if you want to call it an issue, phenomena, maybe is the better word, is really, it's a spatial scale. It's not really a problem. It's a spatial scale result. Just simply that there's many more species than are already present in your county. Therefore, you have a lot of candidate range shifters. And, you know, I think there's a couple things that could potentially get layered on to those results to help constrain that list a little bit. So like dispersal mechanism might help. Whether it gets traded commercially, so is it a horticultural species, would probably increase the likelihood that it would move around and be able to establish. But I also think that it's not a pattern that's going to disappear no matter what we do, simply because you're talking about a really small geographic region with a really long species list.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And because like you're saying, earlier I had a question, but then I kind of answered it myself about the dispersal. But the other thing is our soils and the conditions here on Nantucket are limiting. So I think if we do take that larger list and then we can like use that to kind of self-select what are even within there is going to be a useful tool. We do have a question from Sam, who is on island, he said he joined late, but he's really excited to check out the recording, so thank you. But he's curious if with a shifting climate, any invasives in particular may do worse or be less of a concern in the Northeast moving forward. So that's, some of that map you showed earlier, but in Northeast specific, are there things that are going to be less of a problem than they are now?
The short answer is yes. We haven't focused on generating a list or a tool of what those species are. So if there are particular species that you're managing now that you're interested in just taking a look at what the range dynamics might look like moving forward, you can use the species specific tool to visualize those. So one that comes to mind is garlic mustard. Its range definitely starts to move around on the map and sort of like shift northward out of the Northeast. I can't think of any others off the top of my head, but I know they're there. And so this is actually giving me an idea for the next thing we need to work on. Like, what's the species that maybe you're really concerned about now that might be vacating our region? But quite honestly, we've been more worried about the species that we feel like we might be able to put a barrier in front of, rather than the ones that are perhaps going to persist, but then not be able to sustain their populations moving forward. So Sam, I appreciate the question. I realize that wasn't a super satisfying answer in terms of like, here's the list. But I would encourage you, if there are particular species you're working on that you're curious about, to go look at those maps for those particular species, and that will or should answer your question about those particular species.
The other thing too, I was thinking with that is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jenica, but in trying to predict where species might move into, it's more of a broad brush because you want to be ready for whatever comes. And as things might blip out, you want to be maybe more refined in your confidence, because there are always going to be these little pockets of microhabitat that might hold on to some of those species.
Yep, actually, you've mentioned sort of habitats a couple times, and I think that's a really important point to bring up. I realize, Nantucket has a lot of these special habitats, and frankly, there's across the Northeast, there's especially coastal areas, things like bogs, for example. And everything I've talked about today in terms of the mapping of these range shifts, for better or worse, can't take those things into account. And I say can't because we don't have maps of where those things are across the country or even across whole regions. So soils, for example, the resolution and the quality of soil maps at large spatial scales are just not very good. And so we don't, at least right now, we don't have the capacity, at a national scale, which is what we use for this modeling work, to incorporate that level of ecological detail, which I agree is actually really important when you're talking about on-the-ground management. I don't have a good answer for how to bridge that gap from a modeling perspective at this point. Where I think it comes in is sort of like what we've done with the impacts assessments is, okay, like here's the longer list of species. What do we know about these species that helps us cross some of them off the list? And that will vary depending on where you are and what types of habitats you're working in. So I hate to shift some of the burden back onto the people who are using the lists, and we're working hard to take some of that burden off by doing the ICAT assessments. We make all of those assessments publicly available, but some of it is quite location specific to the extent that we're not even going to have the knowledge that we need in order to refine those lists.
I think that's a great point, is that there's different steps of this type of research too, where there's the broad brush or the bigger picture regionally that is really helpful to learn from our neighbors from the south and as our climate changes. And then it's like the due diligence of those of us on the ground are with really specific either locations or species in mind to kind of do a different type of, assessment. And I think they all go hand in hand. So I think that's really great.
I mean, I wish I had the perfect answer. I could, tie a nice bow on the package, but unfortunately it's not quite that neat.
So I have a question about, I haven't gone to any of the conferences that RISC has held, and can you speak about some of that science manager relations, like, in terms of the type of research and science that's available at those meetings, and hopefully that will be again.
I know. Yeah, it's funny. It has certainly evolved over time. I mean, RISC was started by a bunch of researchers that wanted to do management relevant work. And so that research bent still flows through some of what we do. And so the earlier symposia were more research heavy. The last couple symposia that we've had, we've aimed quite intentionally to have each session, or at least the balance of the day, be a roughly 50-50 mix of researchers and managers presenting on their work. So, for example, I've talked about this tool at the RISC meetings. We've had international researchers that work on invasive species policy come talk in terms of how species move around the globe. And we've had people who are working on sort of climate, what I'm going to call, they didn't call it this, but I'm going to call it this, climate smart restoration projects, where they're restoring forests. And instead of planting only local genotypes, which they did some of, they're also planting species and genotypes of local species for more southerly locations, sort of keeping in mind that climate change is going to continue to happen. Trees take a long time to mature. And so they want trees that they're planting now that are going to be able to persist over the long term. So they're thinking about what species those are and what genotypes and ecotypes they're using. We've had panels of invasive species policymakers talking about how they incorporate climate change or not into their management plans and their management activities. In cases where climate change really isn't being incorporated, they've talked about what the barriers are to them incorporating climate change. Yeah, hopefully that sort of gives a flavor of what's happening.
Well, it's great, because I think, for those listening to that, people are kind of seeking information, like Sam, who might be, doing some management work and looking for more information. And then, others who might be interested, maybe attended, I feel like I've attended more either research-based conferences or management-based conferences. And I think it's really wonderful because of my personal role. I feel like I do a little bit of both. So it's nice to have that combined, and also to that we can make decisions with the latest research. And that's, pretty awesome. We're going to be wrapping up in a minute, but I did the last kind of question or thing I wanted you to comment on was something you kind of said at the end, was about being or talking regionally about proactive regulation. And I'm really, really interested in that, especially from our perspective on the island. Just so you know where we're coming from, we have a lot of species that we consider invasives that aren't maybe on the state list because they're only really here, and we have a very different climate from like the rest of the state as it stands currently. And so we see that more and more. So I'm just really interested to hear more about the efforts that your group is doing or taking and where that's going.
I'm so glad you asked, because I cut it out of the talk because I didn't think I had time to talk about it. But
I'm like, I want to hear about policy.
I have slides. We have data. So we've actually been working on this question for a couple years now. And so we've reviewed all of the regulated plant lists for the Northeastern plus part of the Mid-Atlantic. And so here you've like each box is a state, and the quantification is the proportion of the list that is proactively regulated. So by proactive, we mean they are species that are not yet present in that state. And so the boxes that range up towards the top of the plot are more reactive lists. So they're species that are already there and widespread. And at the bottom of the plot are more proactive species. And so you notice the boxes are up at the top of the plot. So the lists are generally reactive. And so we sort of said, okay, well, if we're saying that we can actually predict some of these range shifts, we know what species might be coming, we know where they might be going, we should be able to do better than this. So how do we do better? And so we actually pulled together representatives from the invasive plant councils or their equivalents. They're not always called an IPC, from 7 of the Northeast states in February of this year, right before everything got shut down, to try to understand how states were making their regulated species lists, if there were sort of like official non-regulatory lists that were used by states to distribute to land managers, for example, of like, these aren't banned species, but you should watch out for them because they have high impacts. And we really wanted to talk about how do we do this more proactively. But what we learned is that different states didn't even have a good handle on the process of all of the other Northeast states. And so that's actually what we've been doing since February, is we've collected all of the protocols that states use to generate their regulated invasive plant lists. And we have essentially categorized them into the types of questions that they ask in order to list a species. To look for commonalities among states, like are all states looking for widespread species? Are all states looking for species that are spread by humans? And so on. And then we took a closer look at the actual weed risk assessments that each state did. So the people who came to this meeting, if they had formal weed risk assessments that had been done on species, they gave them to us. And so we took those and said, okay, well, what is the outcome of this weed risk assessment? So Massachusetts, for example, it could get ranked as invasive, likely invasive. I'm forgetting the not invasive.
Potentially invasive.
Yeah, so the MIPAG rankings, yeah. That then get pushed forward for potential regulation. So we said, okay, like what are those rankings for Massachusetts for each of the species that got evaluated? Then we went to the New Hampshire list, and the words that they use are different from state to state. So in Massachusetts, it might be invasive. In New Hampshire, it's prohibited, for example, is the word that they use. But it allowed us to map from state to state for species that were commonly evaluated across states, like even though the protocols are different, do we essentially get the same impact assessment out of that? And so that's where we stand right now, is we've done all of those comparisons. We have a meeting next week with the folks that came to this first meeting to report back to them and say, you asked us to synthesize all of the assessment protocols and all of the weed risk assessments that had been completed in the Northeast. Here they are. We as a risk group have some ideas of what we think would be useful next steps. But because we are trying so hard to support co-production of knowledge, not just researchers saying, here, we think this is interesting, use it. Like we're actually asking managers, like what is useful to you? we'll see what comes out of that meeting as next steps for where we'll go. Because frankly, at this point, there hasn't been a climate change component to the work that we've done with the ISCs. It's just been like, where are we with invasives, period. So I think the next steps are, okay, well, how do we wrap climate change into this?
I'm so glad I asked this question.
Yeah.
This was, this is so important to hear. And I think, once again, to bring people together, even if we can't actually be together anymore, but to bring the knowledge base together, I think is so important. And it sounds like, I also really appreciate hearing from the RISCC, that risk perspective, that you guys are recognizing, really listening to each other. And I think that's so wonderful to hear. We do have one more question.
Sure.
That I didn't want to negate. So you, Jenica, mentioned that we can work to establish quote unquote barriers to movement for incoming invasives. Within the species-specific tool, is there information about what effective barriers could be, like soil type, biocontrol, or coordinated removal, or is that up to the user to kind of find out that information?
That's a good question. So in the listing tool, all of the species names, both the scientific names and the common names, are linked to the EDDMap's species pages. So it'll take you, you click on the link, it'll either change the page or open a window, new tab, depending on your browser. And so whatever information EDDMap's has pulled together on that species will be one click away. Beyond that, the ICAT assessments that we've completed, those aren't directly linked to the tools, though we're talking about that with the EDDMap's folks. As of right now, they reside on the RISC website. And so you'd have to go to the RISC website and then navigate to the ICAT assessment work. And then you can dig into the spreadsheet that we've created from there. And so that spreadsheet would tell you what the specific impact concerns were for that species. So I would say the one piece that we haven't pulled together yet are management techniques for individual species beyond what's on the EDDMap's page, which isn't really anything. So that's a part where that would be yet an additional step to go to Google, go to your broader networks to say, okay, I'm concerned about this species, like, how do you deal with it? I will say we've done, both formal and informal surveys of the RISC network of what species people are concerned about. And we've been working on developing webinars around the species that we hear about the most. That obviously won't satisfy everybody's needs, but it will be a resource. So we've done a stiltgrass webinar. We've got a mile-a-minute one, not yet scheduled, but it'll be sometime later in the fall. And then we've got a list of other species that we'll be working on after that. We have a climate smart silviculture webinar sort of in between now and when the mile-a-minute webinar will happen as well. So
that's great information too, because I think in addition to like Googling, different control methods for individual species, some of it will be pertinent, different counties and towns have different restrictions for working in the wetlands, or what pesticides you can use or what you can't. And so, there's a little bit of specificity, but I think, that's really good information.
Yeah.
All right, I think we are going to have to wrap up. So I want to, again, thank Jenica, Dr. Allen, for joining us today. This was such a great presentation and so much good information for us. I am really excited for future meetings and hearing more about the work that RISC is doing. Yeah, so once again, if anyone has further questions, you can reach out to Dr. Allen. And as we wrap up, I did want to mention We are working on our next science pub for August. We have a few things in the works, but I can't say anything yet until it's finalized. So keep a lookout on our website, events page, as well as our Facebook page. We've also, the Linda Loring Nature Foundation has recently sponsored a talk, or in June we sponsored a talk with the Nantucket Book Festival, but because the book festival couldn't happen in person, they have recorded all their interviews and we'll be releasing them out through the summer. So we sponsored David Wallace Wells, author of Uninhabitable Earth, and that interview was recorded in late June, but they're going to be distributing it sometime in August, so we will be also posting about that for information on that. So thanks again, Jenica, and it's good to see you.
Likewise, thanks for the invite. This was great.
Thanks. Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.
All right, I'm going to stop recording. You want to stop recording?